Welcome back to Psychology Applied to Work. I've got my Peter Gabriel t-shirt on, and I've got some masala chai tea. So we must be ready to start Chapter 6, Performance Appraisals. So this is Lecture 16 of Performance Appraisal Methods. Let's get going. All right. Lecture 15 was about retention. That was a bonus lecture. And that was talking about how do you keep your talent. And we talked about the importance of first impressions. We talked about the different kinds of retention, formal and informal retention programs that organizations often have. We talked about the good and the bad of surveys. And we talked about exit interviews. So today is the first lecture of Chapter 6. All three lectures will be related to performance. This lecture will be focused on the different types of performance appraisal methods, and then next lecture we'll get into things like bias and error and that sort of thing. So we're going to start with what is performance appraisal, some aspects of it, what is its purpose. Along the way we'll talk about what is or isn't effective. We'll talk about a common way that performance appraisals manifest themselves, and that is in the form of performance ratings. But we'll also talk about several other appraisal methods. All right. So what is performance appraisal? So you're evaluating an employee's performance, but it's typically both time-based, which is to say you're covering a set period of time, typically up to the present. An annual time period is the most common. Years ago that was called your annual review. Did you get your annual review? But often organizations have put things like mid-year, sort of mini appraisals. Different organizations might have it quarterly, or more often, but more informal. Organizations are definitely different, and then within an organization, sometimes you have a very set performance appraisal system with a very set cadence. Other organizations, you might have some variability across different hierarchies within the organization, but an annual review of an employee's performance, including your own, is the most common thing that you'll find in American organizations. So it's time-based, but it's also systematic. So what does that mean? So it's following a defined process. You are typically articulating in a performance appraisal system, what it is that somebody's job's expectations were, and for the time-based stuff, for this is your performance appraisal for 2020 whatever. Usually you'll have some unique things that were put in front of you for that year that sometimes will be called goals. You may have defined them yourselves, or you may have had them imposed on you by your manager or supervisor. It really depends. There's going to be some sort of format, often forms that you follow. It's a lot of organizations now have these things, have a workflow that uses some sort of online tool. Not always, but some organizations it's still, you'll get an email from your manager with a document, or even the document could literally just be the words inside the email for sort of the least structured way. But if you're in a mature organization, there's a good chance that there'll be a formal tool that you use and that your supervisor use. So you're providing feedback. What is going well, and what is maybe not going so well, and it's usually framed positively in terms of what are opportunities to improve, and then you're defining that around your job requirements, and done properly in most organizations, that those job requirements will have been built by job analysis at some point. So all of these things come first full circle. So you've got to a job analysis to figure out what actually work needs to happen, and then you turn that into job requirements and job descriptions and that sort of thing, and then that would actually go into the methods that you use to appraise the performance, so that you have things are systematic and things are reasonably objective. Okay, so performance appraisals, they're time-based and they're systematic. All right, let's talk about some aspects of performance appraisal. You're typically looking at the task or the job, or say you might have had several assignments throughout the year. It really depends on how your work is defined. Some people are working on 17 different things that come and go throughout the year. Some people are working on one big project. Depends on the job, depends on a lot of things, but you're looking at performance competence. How well did you execute your tasks? But so that's you can think of that as the what. Remember, there's the what and the how. Task performance versus contextual performance. So the first is the what. The what did you do? The task performance, and then this other half in terms of aspects of performance appraisal is the how, or the contextual performance. So that is the social aspects, which is the team aspects, which is the collaboration. How did your performance improve or maybe actually hurt the team around you, the greater organization? Whether that is whether you did things to support the culture, or maybe you actually did things that ended up causing other people to lose motivation or trust, or there's good and bad to the contextual performance. It's really how well did you contribute to the team and the culture. That may include the CWBs, if you remember, the counterproductive work behavior, but there's also the organizational citizenship behaviors. What are the ways in which you acted that made this or our organization a better place to work, and what are the ways in which you maybe acted, what are your behaviors that maybe caused our organization to be a little bit less than it could be. So those are the contextual related. So there's two predominant aspects, and they go back to just the same way that you do your job analysis, which is the task and the context. So are you doing anything to detract from the team? But you also might use a performance appraisal as a kind of check on not just how are you doing on your task performance and your contextual performance, but it might be a way that your organization forces a conversation around, are you doing the best job you can be doing, or is there a different job, or should we maybe change your job? So depending upon the flexibility that an organization has, some organizations it just isn't an option. You got to do what you got to do, and you'd be better off doing other things, but this is the job that we've got to have you do. If you don't do this job, we can't pay bills. But other organizations might have enough of a critical mass of employees or whatever, might have some flexibility that it could be in their best interest to look at this as a job crafting opportunity. So does your particular job niche, does that need to be updated to better reflect your strengths and your gaps that have emerged over time as your performance has been on display? For your organization, directly for your supervisor. Your supervisor may have been your supervisor for a couple of years, has had a chance to really, get to know you and see what you do really well and what you don't do well. And this is sometimes an opportunity to redefine your job a little bit. But I wouldn't say that's typical. I don't know, I don't know if anybody knows what fraction of organizations formally use performance management for job crafting, but even if it's not formal, it's often informal. As a manager, you're always looking to try to figure out how to, so you work on try to maximize somebody's strengths and you try to minimize somebody's gaps. But at the same time, you recognize that not everybody can minimize their gaps, and for some people it's a lifelong struggle to, improve in an area that maybe they're not that great at. It's in your best interest as a manager to see if there's ways you can structure the work that the gaps don't don't manifest. So in a way, that's a kind of job crafting. So it definitely happens whether you're consciously aware of it as a leader or not. Okay, so remember the what and the how, the task and the context keep coming up. All right, so what is the purpose of a performance appraisal if it isn't obvious? I mean, some things are obvious, like, well, we're ultimately looking to improve it. We're looking at trying to do whatever we can to make sure that you bring your best self, your most motivated, your most engaged, the best of your strengths and the least of your gaps to work, and to get you the most aligned as possible to what the organization needs to improve your performance. But it's also a structure. Performance appraisal isn't typically just a thing where you've worked, especially within salaried professionals. It isn't typically a thing that you just do your work for a year and all of a sudden your supervisor takes you aside and says, here I give you your appraisal. Usually you know what you are being judged on. Usually you have like a start of the year conversation around this is the dimensions that are going to be appraised. This might be some goals to focus on. And that allows you to monitor yourself. That allows you to sort of self-regulate throughout the year, assuming that it is your desire to have a good performance rating, or certainly not a failing grade. And we'll talk about ratings later on in the lecture. But a good performance management system and a good performance appraisal process is something where the employee themselves is well aware of throughout the year, and that they can think about it and use it as a motivator to monitor their own behavior and to work on improving their own behavior, to again maximize their strengths and close their gaps, as they say. All right. It's also a way for organizations to make decisions about the employee and the job and how well they're aligned. And those might be job crafting decisions, but it could also be a job changing decision. So it could be assessing, where who should be promoted and where should they be promoted to, or it might be where should people be moved laterally, which is to say they didn't get a raise or they didn't get a pay grade bump. They don't have sort of more responsibilities that are commensurate with a higher pay. They would just have different responsibilities, or they might have the same kind of job, but they're in a different area. There's a lot of ways that laterals might manifest, but performance appraisals can be used for promotions and laterals, but they can also be used for determining who is not performing, and who is consistently not doing their job, frankly. So it is very rare in a organization to have like, okay, here's your performance appraisal that you have been waiting for, and you got to fail, and so you're fired today. I mean, usually there's a long process. Oftentimes, unless you, there are certainly things you can do, workplace violence, often things like workplace pornography. There's red lines you can cross that you just short circuit the whole performance appraisal, and you'll be out the door that day if there's convincing evidence that you did something to cross the red line. But that's different. If you're simply underperforming, just consistently not meeting the acceptable line of what's considered successful performance, to be fired is usually something that involves formal processes. You typically aren't fired because of your first performance appraisal that says you're not doing your job. Usually then you have a process, and HR is heavily involved, and they're trying to create a good documentation trail to make sure every process, all processes that were done were fair, so that if in fact you end up being fired, there's good evidence, good documentation to show that you were fired for good, objective, fair reasons, so that the company's protected from or at least has a stronger case if there's a lawsuit brought aboard. So firing is a big deal. It's very serious for most organizations. There's certainly some small companies and even desperate companies that they just struggle to make payroll, that they just might short circuit all that and take their risks from a lawsuit standpoint, and firing might be a little bit more summary as it is. But anyway, you get the idea that there's of those purposes for performance appraisals. But there's also a lot of useful information you can get from performance appraisal. So you can look at across your organization, looking sort of aggregating across the different performance appraisals or within a particular part of your organization. And you might see, hey, we consistently seeing subpar performance, or, we're just not seeing very much really above average performance. I really think that the tasks that we're asking of people are beyond their training. We really need to increase the level of experience of our people. So it can actually help you to determine where to spend the resources on training and development. It can also help you with your selection tests, which is to say the process you use to hire people, to recruit and to hire. And if you made these decisions about selection, if your selection tests are valid, then the people that you hire should be reasonably performing. And if in fact a lot of your people you've been hiring, because you grew a lot or opened up a new plant or whatever, so a bunch of new people were hired, and then you discover that, boy, these people are just not performing the way other parts of our organization are. And we did put in that new selection process that we thought was valid. Well, okay, now you've got some real-world empirical evidence that maybe your selection process isn't valid. So it's a good way to performance appraisal, how well people are doing, is a good way to validate or invalidate your selection test methods. And more generally, HR could be doing other ways of conducting research, and that would be, is your selection test valid, is a way that HR would be investigating their own process. But there'd be lots of things that the human resources might want to look at in terms of differences in performance across teams, and effectiveness of managers, effectiveness of hiring, what's the average amount of experience that relates to performance, all sorts of things that human resources might want to look at. And then another purpose of performance appraisal, which I talked a little bit about, is you're establishing a documentation trail that says that you have fair processes. If you pick somebody for a promotion, recall our conversation about employment law and protected classes. You need to make sure that your systems are fair, legal, moral, and having a defined process that's valid. And consistently applied is a good way to shore up your legal defenses and to reduce the likelihood of getting sued. So those are the predominant purposes here. So you're trying to, first of all, improve performance, but you're also using it to make decisions, employment decisions within your organization. You're also using it to get useful information, including to validate your hiring decisions and processes. And you're also establishing solid, proactive legal defense framework. All of that should be fairly straightforward, I hope. All right, so let's get into a graphic. So this, there will be stuff on this on the test. The test is open book, open note, not open friend. So the wording on these things, these aren't super intuitive wordings of things. You've got these things called actual criterion and ultimate criterion, and criterion contamination, and criterion relevance, and criterion deficiency. And we'll go through what these things are. They're actually pretty basic, and I'll maybe explain it a couple different ways for you. But this is a high-level measure or a way to look at how effective your performance appraisal is. And if you look at the circle that is made out of the green and the yellow, So look at everything on that picture that's the green and the yellow. If some of you may be red-green colorblind, it is the circle on the left. That in the circle has the criterion deficiency and the criterion relevance. So that circle is the stuff that actually matters. So that's the performance that actually makes the widgets for your company, or makes the sales, or improves the process, writes the software, whatever it is. That's the performance that you should care about. That's the performance that matters. Now the circle on the right that's constituted by the red and the yellow, and the words criterion contamination and criterion relevance, that circle on the right is called the actual criterion. The circle on the left, the green and yellow circle, it's also described as the left circle, that's called the ultimate criterion. And then the circle on the right is called the actual criterion. So actual means what did you actually measure? And ultimate on the left is what ultimately matters. And the important part of this is that inevitably in any performance appraisal system, you will have things you're measuring your employees on that really don't matter. And you'll have things that do matter that you're not getting in your measure. It is inevitable. And the goal is to try to increase that overlap, that middle overlap that says criterion relevance, that yellow portion. You want those two circles to push close to each other as much as possible. And ideally, there would be no red or yellow. It would all be one big circle, that everything you would use in your performance appraisal is exactly what matters and you don't miss anything. But that is absolutely impossible because of complexity. It should be hopefully clear to you that now that the complexity that constitutes anybody's job far exceeds our ability to define it on a piece of paper and call it a job description, and far exceeds our ability to create measures you can put numbers to. So you do the best you can, but you definitely want to recognize that the stuff on the red, that's wasteful activity. You're judging somebody using a measure, and then those people are going to be like trying to make that part of their measure better. And none of that has to do with something that helps your customer or improves your bottom line or your top line. You know, it sells more stuff or makes you more money, or or whatever. If you're not a profit-seeking organization, it's not stuff that actually is part of your organization's mission. It's just wasteful activity. It's just theater, jazz hands, stupid activity that you as a supervisor are driving because driving your people to do, and your people are doing it because they want a good performance rating, so they keep their job and hopefully get a raise and maybe a promotion. But your performance appraisal system, your performance management system might be imposing all this. So this is a big deal. It's one of those trillion-dollar problems. Okay, so that was the description of it, and now let's go through some bullets to state it again, because these words are kind of gnarly, silly wording, non-intuitive type wording for things. No offense to whoever came up with them, but they're not, easy to remember. So performance is complicated, and measuring all of the aspects, it is impossible. And getting even to a measurable at all is hard to when you really think about it. How are you going to assess somebody's performance? And what criteria are you going to use? How are you going to say it was good or bad? And in some cases it's pretty straightforward. In other cases it isn't. And then a lot of measures are wasteful. That's all that stuff on the right there, all the stuff in the red. So an effective performance appraisal is you're trying to maximize that yellow. You're trying to maximize that center overlap area. And that is the stuff that you're measuring that matters. And you're trying to minimize the red, what's called criterion contamination. And that is the stuff that you measure that doesn't matter. But that actually, that'll include things in your tools that have bias and error in the tools, not necessarily the individual human bias and error. And we're going to talk quite a bit about those individual human bias and error in our next lecture. That should be interesting. But a lot of times the tools themselves have error in them, or and bias, in the sense the tools are focused on certain things. And as the supervisor, you're sort of forced to use the tools, or you're stuck in the frame of the tools. And so that might steer you to a lot of the red. You're trying to minimize that when you're doing when you create you being like a human resources department or whatever, when you're trying to create an effective performance appraisal system, you want to be really well aware of this red, green, and yellow, and you're trying to capture all the green by making it yellow and having no red when you're done. But that's impossible, but you try to do the best you can. So you're trying to reduce the amount of green by getting it to yellow. You reduce the stuff on the left you miss. And that, again, the stuff on the left is called the criterion deficiency. And you're trying to make all of that go away so that the ultimate criterion, that's everything that encompasses the left circle, becomes all yellow. At least as best you're able. That the words again, starting with the thing that you're actually measuring that you care about is that criterion relevance. That's the yellow. The stuff you wish you would measure but you're not is the criterion deficiency. The total of everything that you should be measuring, even though you're only measuring a portion of it, is the ultimate criterion. And then the stuff you're measuring that you really shouldn't be measuring is your criterion contamination. And then the net total of what you are measuring, that includes the good stuff as well as the junk, is the actual criterion. So I've said this a few different times to try to get you, hopefully one of these ways I've explained it gets the aha, because it is actually pretty simple. This is the way to look, at least at a high level, at your performance appraisal effectiveness. And ultimately, if you use multiple measures, that is a way to reduce how much green is. As you look at, you're not just looking at one dimension, you're not just looking at one behavior. You want to hit it as many ways as is reasonable. And in fact, that can sometimes even involve more than one person doing an appraisal. But certainly you want to appraise people across multiple dimensions. The more you do it, the longer things take, the more cumbersome it is, the more complex it is. So there's certainly a trade-off. And then to whatever extent you can, incorporate objective measures. But some performance inevitably is subjective. Okay, so let's talk about ratings. The most common method is some sort of form that you get your rating in, and it's usually driven by the manager. Usually that manager or supervisor is the one that actually determines what your rating is. And a rating is sort of like a summary of your performance appraisal. And not every organization distills your. It's like just think of this as a grade. A, B, C, D. There are colleges you can go to that don't have grades, that have people write up a summary of stuff, or there's all sorts of sort of subjective ways that you might be assessed. But the majority, vast majority of places have grades. And the vast majority of organizations that do performance appraisal summarize it in the form of ratings. It's easy, everybody kind of understands it, simplifies it. You'll often have a rating that will also come with written comments. So think of it like a ABCD, but also a paragraph or two explaining the rationale behind why you got an A or a B or a C. Of course, those aren't typically the ratings; they're typically numeric, with words associated with them, and I'll introduce those to you in just a second. So a way the process often happens, and again, this can be different, but usually the employee does some sort of first line thing. Often the most common thing that happens in organizations is some form of either limited or detailed self-assessment, which is sort of okay, it's time to do our annual performance rating. Tell me how you think you did. And then I'll look at that and I'll come back and tell you whether I agree and tell you where I might disagree. Something along those lines is the most common way it's done. So as you do your self-assessment, that's kind of what I did on my summer vacation essay in some cases, but you're basically trying to take credit for what your accomplishments are, and then often the supervisor will then have a response, and that will be typically a formal thing, and that will be your a formal appraisal. And it might be written as a back and forth, as in you said this for this part of your project, and here's what I think. And when things go really well, it would take the form of, you know, I absolutely 100% agree. You did great on that. Other cases it might be, well, you know, kind of missed this, and this could have been better. And then often that response is summarized by a final rating. And the most common is a 1 to 5 scale. It isn't always like this, but this is, you know, I believe the lion's share of them are some form of a 1 to 5 scale. So we're going to look at what that typically means. A 1 to a 2, that's usually a problem. Think of that as your DNF. You know, a 1 being like, did you even show up for work? And a 2 being, you know, you did some things, but all in all, you did not, you know, pass the minimum bar. You definitely are below acceptable. You know, you cannot continue to do this and remain employed. We've got to do some serious intervention here. So that often comes with a number like a 1 or a 2. And if you got like a 2, that's kind of like getting a D. And then it would often come with a descriptor, and performance needs improvement, you know, or does not meet the expectations, or unsuccessful, and the different ways that companies can do it. And they frame it sort of different ways, but they're all sort of the same thing, you know, below the line. And then a 3 is typically, okay, hey, you know, you're above the line, you passed. You could think of that maybe as a C, that you're at acceptable levels. And that often might have a name of you met the expectations, or your performance was successful, or above the line, or what have you. Those are the common terms. And a 4 means your performance was above average, and you might get that accompanied with something like exceeds expectations, or, you know, very successful, or highly successful, and that sort of thing, or significantly above the line, or whatever. Then a rating of 5 usually means that the performance was exceptional. That might have the term far exceeds expectations, or extraordinarily successful, or outstanding, that sort of thing. But it's important to remember that people they're humans involved in these things, and it's common for people to view themselves along a lot of dimensions as above average. You know, if you ask them, you know, do you consider yourself to be above average or below average in blank? Maybe it's how hard you work, maybe it's intelligence, maybe it's charisma, maybe it's even looks. It really kind of depends. You know, people like to think of themselves as above average. I know the math doesn't work. I mean, half the people have to be below average if you're actually going to have an average at all. But you know, people don't like to find out that they're average, and they don't like that. You know, we tend to be a culture where you know, it's sort of the everybody gets a trophy, but it's sort of it's everything's positive and presented in positive ways. So you will find in some organizations a little bit of drift, a little bit of a shifting of what the average is, and so that an average becomes something that another organization might actually reserve for higher performance. So as an example, you might have a place where 4 is actually considered average, and not a 3 or a 3.5 or something like that. In that to get a 4, you get to have it presented to you like, good job, you're above average, when in fact the vast majority of the people in the department may have gotten a 4. You just don't know. So sometimes you'll see this sort of concentrating towards the higher end to make people feel good. in the end, the dollars work out, which is to say, organizations have a budget for raises, and if everybody gets like a 4.6 to 4.9, there's still only X amount of dollars typically. So, and those dollars have to be spread, and if they're spread according to the differences, then a 4.9 becomes way more different than a 4.6, whereas in other organizations, a 3 and a 4 and a 5 might have meant that same thing. I think you get the idea. Try not to beat it to death, but 1 to 5 with these wordings or variations of this is the most common. In some organizations, a 3 really means, that's a good job. You got a 3. It's no big deal. We don't, if you did better than that, that's great. But we definitely like you and you're doing a good job. In other organizations, a 3 might actually mean, oh, I got a 3. So you really want to know that going in so that you don't get yourself disappointed or think you're doing better than you are and not all organizations will even admit that they may have drifted on this. But organizations are run by humans. All right, so let's talk about some other ways that performance ratings are established. And in some cases, there's ways of doing it as sort of contextual ratings, which is to say that somebody's higher than somebody else, which is to sort, and that would be a couple of ways of doing that. One is a ranking technique where if you're the manager and you have or you're a supervisor and you have 10 people that work for you, some performance appraisal systems will ask you to rank your employees by job performance, by effectiveness, by who would you keep. Depends on what lens you want to put to it, but stack ranking from best. Susan is my best, and Billy Bob's my worst. That's kind of harsh because somebody's at the bottom, but some companies are like this, and so that's a stack ranking technique. I guess the upside of this is if you get ranked and say, well, there's 10 people in the group and your number is 7, and that's 7 on the bottom, so there's 6 people better than you, so you might want to step it up a notch. At least you know where you stand. But if that's all you get, you get it's a relative scale. It doesn't really give you the information you need what am I supposed to improve on? It needs to be followed up with some other type of appraisal system in order to get feedback on performance. And there's another way of doing a ranking that perhaps is maybe a little bit maybe ends up being a little bit better because it's sometimes just difficult to decide who's number 6 and who's number 7. And that's if you've got 10 employees in your group, is you do a 1-to-1 comparison to each one of them. Susan is combined with Billy Bob, but Billy Bob's also compared to Fred, and Fred is compared to somebody else. And in each one of your pairings, so I don't know what that number is, if 10 of them, maybe that's like 45 or so combinations or something like that. The person, the manager, usually has an easier time with a dichotomy, like Billy Bob or Susan. Well, Susan definitely. And so while that might be hard to feel like you can accurately stack rank everybody, if you find you can easily decide who's better between two people, you end up with kind of like a matchup game, where somebody is consistently ranked higher than a bunch of people, but not one person. But that one person might actually be ranked lower than a bunch of other people that were higher than the one person, if you follow that. Just because when you look at people and you ask yourself which one is performing better, you might cue different thoughts about in different examples and different behaviors and that sort of thing. So by doing that rank multiple ways, it's kind of a way at trying to bring out more dimensionality in how you assess this, and trying to tease out a little less bias, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. Another way is force distribution, which is, and there are definitely organizations that do this. There are places that every single year, as the manager, it's kind of like stack ranking, but it's more like buckets. Like, put your top 20% of performers in this bucket, and they get big raises, and they get eligible for promotions or whatever. Put your midland people, say your middle 70%, in this bucket, and they might get a little raise, and they get to keep their job. But put your bottom 10% in this bucket, and they're not going to get a raise. And if they get 10% bottom rankings in a row, they're fired or something. I mean, there are organizations that are that ruthless, and people usually know that going in. And where if you find a company that's ruthless like that, they're also typically quite good on the upside. And so if you find yourself in an organization that it's like, geez, these people, they really drum you out quick if you don't perform. Oftentimes those organizations will have pretty high reward for the top performers, so that those people that win, really win, and those people that lose, really lose. So there's upside and definitely a downside. Otherwise, if all you did was the punitive, you would, as an organization, you would find yourself having lost most of your good talent. So a lot of organizations do it differently, but this force distribution technique. Definitely happens, and I've been part of organizations in the past that have implemented a couple different versions of this, and I have been involved in a force distribution technique, and most of my experiences that were on the typical 1 to 5 ratings, but I have done a few different versions of this, and there's definitely pros and cons on all of them. And then there's a different force. So that was the force distribution. So you got 3 buckets, sort your people. But then there's a force choice one, which is you're coming up with, it's a way to assess your people across different dimensions. So you have a force choice between 2 descriptors. And both descriptors might be desirable things, like customer focused and quality focused. Well, you want somebody that's both, but you might get stuck where you actually have to decide, is Billy Bob more one or the other? And you might do that across a whole bunch of different dimensions to all your people, and it might not be very fun to do, because there definitely would be times where you're like, well, he's kind of both, but it forces you to pick which one is he slightly better or worse at, and then that creates its own sort of the combining of all of those things can kind of show up, well, where are the strengths and where are the weaknesses in that particular person. So there's definitely pros and cons to all of these things, and a number of them I would suggest shouldn't be used by themselves. But again, the more types of rating methods you use, the less bias and the less error you have. But again, everything takes time and money. All right, so let's keep going. But now we're going to get into some sort of nitty-gritty specifics here, and talk about a little bit more formal ways that some organizations do things. And so one is what's called behaviorally anchored rating scales, or BARs, and that's where you might have a bunch of behaviors that always does what the customer wants, or always gets their work done on time, or whatever. It might not have the term always, but something that's sort of summative of behavior that would typically, you're reflecting on the person, presumably throughout the year, on a particular behavior, and you're going to apply a rating to that. Like maybe it's customer-centric behavior. I don't know, and you'll give a rating to that. But oftentimes those behaviors might be very specific to the job, driven by critical incidents. If you remember back in job analysis, and the subject matter experts, they might come up with, what are very specific things, what are specific behaviors in a job that are considered critical, and you can define that around incidents. And you can use that for performance. But there's another way of doing sort of the same thing, which is you can take those same kinds of behaviors, and instead of trying to like sum those behaviors throughout the year with a rating, you can look at those behaviors more transactionally, of something that you might do or not do in a given day, and you can try to, as the supervisor, assess how frequently you do that behavior. So one is like how well you do that behavior, but it doesn't take into account whether that's a behavior you do a lot or not. The behavioral observation scale, or the BOS, that's looking at what your frequency of those critical incident behaviors are and that have been observed. And then there's CARS, computerized adaptive rating scales, and this is newer. You can think of this as algorithmically driven, like typically with like an online or a whatever, but a computerized tool that would walk you through a rating, and it might do it such that with the term adaptive, kind of like adaptive testing, where each question, if you get it right, then it opens up a harder question. It's not exactly the same, but it's more of a based upon how you answered a rating question, that can ask a sort of ancillary rating question to get more detail, and to ask it in a way that it sort of zeroes in on what the system thinks the performance rating should be, so that instead of you giving a rating, you basically ask a bunch of behaviors, get asked a bunch of behavior specific questions, and sort of a bunch of little situational ratings, and then ultimately that system produces what a total rating is, and that might come in the form of paired statements, this person consistently gets their work done, or this person gets their work done most of the time, or this person is always thinking about others to help them. This person is always thinking about their own work. I mean, there's endless ways of doing that, but it's sort of in this case, it's a forced choice thing, where you're flipping the switch one way or another, and then there's this big algorithm, this big computer program that's basically saying, if you answered this, then check these dimensions, and then you just basically are going through a bunch of descriptors trying to choose which one of two best describes Billy Bob, and then ultimately the system kicks out a rating. I've never used anything like this. I'd want to use it quite a bit before I would trust it, but I can imagine ways of doing this that could be valid, and this is a newer method. Maybe it's the method of the future. I don't know. All right, so let's talk about some other performance appraisal methods. There's peer ratings, and that's really where your peers rate you. Interestingly enough, your peers tend to rate you higher than your supervisor might rate you. They wouldn't feel necessarily the same burden of responsibility over the overall stuff that the supervisor is supposed to feel, and it's a different perspective, and maybe I'm a little bit more biased towards affiliative behavior and supportive behavior. A lot of reasons why that might be. Interestingly enough, the peer ratings, if you have really, really good peer ratings, that over time correlates positively with future for promotions, which shouldn't be a big surprise. It's a way of saying the people that get promoted are people that also tend to be thought of well by their peers. So if your peers don't like you, if your peers think you're really slacking it, you really don't pull your weight, the chances are of you getting promoted are less. And I mean, that should make sense, because if leadership is tuned into what people think, or if leadership is able to witness your performance, if your peers think you're not performing, your leaders probably think you're not performing. So that shouldn't surprise you that there's a correlation there. And then peer ratings tend to be highly variable. So the inter-rater, you look at it as, you can look at it a lot of ways. So you could look at if you have your peers rate you, there'd be a lot of variability across your peers, but you would also see some variability within the same peer over time, depending upon what was happening situationally in your relationship with that person. Another appraisal method is upward feedback, and that's typically where a manager or supervisor is actually appraised by their team. And there's also 360, which would encompass part of that upward feedback. And that's where employees are rated all around. So they're rated by their peers, they're rated by their supervisor, and then if they are themselves supervisors, they're rated by their direct reports. Typical dimensions that a 360 will use are how well does the person work with the people, how well does the person work with change, adapt to change, instigate change, support change, how well does this person work within the structure of this organization, how well does this person adapt to new structures, how well does this person understand and align with the structure of our organization. Read about Craig and Hannum, 2006 in the chapter. And then there's also external feedback, depending on who you are. Maybe you have a customer-facing job. Maybe you're in purchasing and you have a supplier-facing job. Maybe there's other external partners that you interact with. There may be efforts to reach out to get feedback on you and how well you're doing from customers and from suppliers and external partners. All right, 51 minutes. That's a nice bite-sized lecture. Let's recap. So we talked about the methods of performance appraisal. We described what it was. We talked about different aspects of it. And we talked about the purpose. Throughout, we were discussing effectiveness. We talked about rating systems and the typical 1 to 5, but we also got into other things, like stack ranking and that sort of thing, and 360s and the variety of ways that performance appraisals happen. So next lecture, we're going to continue talking about performance appraisals, but we're going to get into the challenges. So we're going to talk about bias and error, and there will be several slides on bias and error. And then we'll talk about what can you do to try to minimize that? What can you do to try to avoid bias and error in appraisals? And then we'll talk about okay, what's the bottom line on performance appraisals, the good, the bad, and the ugly. All right, that was not too bad. We will see you in lecture 17.